10 Democratic candidates squared off in Atlanta to convince American voters they have what it takes to challenge Donald Trump. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The gloves came off once again among presidential candidates in Atlanta on Wednesday night at the 5th Democratic debate. The 10 qualifying candidates sparred over several issues, including healthcare, foreign policy, and climate change. But all were in agreement about the impeachment inquiry underway against U.S. President Donald Trump.
We have a president who is not only a pathological liar, he is likely the most corrupt president in the modern history of America. But we cannot simply be consumed by Donald Trump. Because if we are, you know what? We're going to lose the election.
Well, I learned something about these impeachment trials. I learned, number one, that Donald Trump doesn't want me to be the nominee. That's pretty clear.
We have to establish the principle, no one is above the law. We have a constitutional responsibility, and we need to meet it.
We are absolutely going to confront this president for his wrongdoing, but we are also each running to be the president who will lead this country after the Trump presidency comes to an end, one way or the other.
For more on the presidential debate, let's bring in our panel. Here with us in the studio is Rina Shah. She's the managing director at Red Fort Strategies, a public affairs and government relations firm. Also with us is Boer Deng. She's the Washington correspondent for the British newspaper The Times. From New York, Christopher Hahn is the host of the Aggressive Progressive podcast on Revolver. And Todd Belt is the director of the political management program at George Washington University, right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Christopher Hahn, let's start with you in New York. Well, as we just heard, all the candidates were in agreement about the impeachment hearings against Donald Trump. But let me put it this way, or as the New York Times put it, this was a debate, the New York Times said, that wasn't. It was not a clash of visions among these candidates, but more like a candidate forum. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was hard for them to break through when all the noise right now is about impeachment. After all of these incredible developments the last couple of days in Washington, to go to that debate stage amidst all that, just about an hour and 20 minutes after the last hearing ended, was very difficult for those candidates. So the debate became more about who can beat Donald Trump than about their clash of ideas. And I think that that's really the issue here. I think the Democratic Party is united in one thing, and that is beating Donald Trump. They view him, and I think a lot of people outside of the Democratic Party are starting to view him as an existential threat to the United States Republic. And I think that the candidate that could best express a vision for beating Donald Trump is the one who's going to win. Now, Senator Sanders said, look, it can't just be about beating Donald Trump. You got to say what you're going to do. And to a certain extent, I agree with that. But that is the question for after you become the Democratic nominee. I think party faithful right now are looking for somebody who they want to see go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump.
Rina Shah, at this stage of the nomination race, the polls appear to be all over the place. One of the national polls had Joe Biden way up. But if we look at the polls for Iowa, which was where the first primary poll will take place, it has Pete Buttigieg up there. Did you hear anything in the debate that would change people's minds?
You know, I think yesterday was a tough day in Washington, and that is, you know, to anybody watching, no surprise that to have a debate right after the impeachment inquiry hearing that frankly was very explosive. Ambassador Sondland told the country what we had not heard, that the president directed the bribery plot and that many senior administration officials knew about it. But then we go into the Democrats that evening, and that's really difficult. Like I said, tough day in Washington, but are people outside Washington paying attention? Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what matters here. And Iowa, certainly, look, let's talk about the polls for a second. In 2016, the polls were all wrong. And so I don't put much faith in polls anymore, although I've been a longtime operative. I'll say this, we're a year out. And it seems to me that what we're missing here is that there was only one candidate on stage last night that has a direct involvement in this impeachment inquiry in any way, and that's Biden. So the elephant in the room, what are the Democrats going to do to him? Are they going to continue to eat him alive?
Is that
Are they going to
really-
continue to be fractured?
Yeah, is that going to continue? Is the impeachment hearings going to suck the oxygen out of everything during this election season?
You know, I don't think so, because I don't think many Americans outside the Beltway watch the way we watch. And I think the big cities, certainly, you have a very engaged electorate. But
Yeah.
here in the Mid-Atlantic in general, you just travel down south a few states, you don't hear people talking about this Democratic Party that's put over 20 candidates for a primary. Have
Right.
they learned nothing from the Republicans in 2015, 2016? We had such a crowded field,
Yeah.
and Donald Trump emerged.
Boer Deng, let's talk about some of the substantive issues that were talked about in the debates. There was a sharp exchange between Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Buttigieg on foreign policy. Let's watch that.
I have the right experience to take on Donald Trump. I get that it's not traditional establishment Washington experience, but I would argue we need something very different right now.
I think the most recent example of your inexperience in national security and foreign policy came from your recent careless statement about how you as president would be willing to send our troops to Mexico to fight the cartels.
Well, do you seriously think anybody on this stage is proposing invading Mexico?
That's not
I'm
what I
talking
said.
about
That's not what I
building up.
said.
I'm talking
That's not what
about
I
building
said.
up alliances.
So Tulsi Gabbard has come in for some criticism for the views she has on America's involvement in what she calls regime change wars. She wants to terminate those wars. Is that something that resonates with American voters?
I think the entrance of Ms. Gabbard into this race has been very interesting for the Democrats because a lot of the talking points that she talks about clearly resonates with a certain fraction of the electorate, but many of those are also people who support a fraction of the Democratic Party. As Ms. Gabbard was making these points, there was a pro-Trump Twitter that was sort of tweeting these out at the same time. So it's clearly a problem for Democrats if you've got a candidate on stage who's saying some of these things, which clearly resonates with probably a rather small fraction of the electorate, but nonetheless is being heard on a public stage. I thought Mayor Pete came off quite well in that exchange, and to Rina and your point earlier, there's a reason why he's leading the polls in Iowa and in New Hampshire, the other early states to hold primaries right after Iowa, and it's because he's quite well spoken and showed clearly last night that he can take a little bit of challenge from the other candidates. And the other candidates clearly saw him as somebody to watch, as he was the one who, besides getting into a bit of a fisticuffs with Tulsi Gabbard, also got into it with Amy Klobuchar, who sort of derided him as a local official. And, you know, there is a question about his experience, but at the same time, his point is, look, there's 100 years of Washington experience on this stage, and yet we still couldn't beat Trump. And I think that really resonated last night.
Yeah. Todd Belt, was there a breakout moment for you during this debate, something that would change the whole picture?
Well, I think that was the closest thing to a breakout moment we had was that exchange. There were, of course, some more gaffes by Vice President Biden that happened again, which has a lot of people worried in the Democratic Party. We didn't see any major zinger moments like I was that little girl in the first debate that we've seen in the past. And considering the impeachment things going on and the fact that this was a little less attack-oriented than the previous debates, I was surprised they didn't go after Mayor Pete until later in the debate. Most people thought that the way they went after Warren after she became the front-runner in the last debate that Mayor Pete would have the target on his back, but not quite as much in this debate. The main thing that I think these people in the debate are trying to do is trying to make it to the next one, where the thresholds are going to be a bit higher.
Yeah, Todd, just one point on Joe Biden. Why would Democrats be worried? He is leading in the polls. He's very much the establishment candidate.
Right. He is the establishment candidate. He's leading in the polls, and he is very popular among the black voters in the Democratic Party, which is really important because you can't win without them. The problem is his age, and people want somebody who can go up against President Trump and have the youth and vigor to do it. And of course, Vice President Biden is trying trying to do that. But, you know, when he has the gaffes, people are wondering, does he really still have the chops to be able to do it?
I think that's rather unfair because he's being called very old all the time. They forget that Trump is not far behind him.
Right. Of course.
The reality is Trump is very aggressive. He speaks very fast. He speaks forcefully. Biden is a little bit slower. He's always sort of spoken at this pace. There's an interesting piece I saw out, I believe, in Slate today that's just come out saying that Biden's always stuttered, actually. And these gaffes are sort of man-made. I don't see them at the rate at which the media here in the U.S. tends to talk about them. And I think it's very unfair to speak about somebody of his age and somebody who's accomplished so much.
He's had a
I don't think it's just the,
I'll get to you in a moment.
He's had a long
Chris.
history of this, too.
I'll get to you in a moment, Chris. Go ahead, Boer.
I don't think it's just the gaffes, though. I think, and this kind of ties back to what we had been talking about earlier with Pete Buttigieg leading in the polls despite his inexperience, and two other candidates who weren't on the stage last night who one of them has jumped in, Deval Patrick, and the other one who may jump in, Michael Bloomberg, is that they sense his vulnerability.
That's right.
The fact that he's an establishment candidate, well, that didn't go so well for Democrats in 2016, and I think there's a good deal of fear about that. Secondly, the vice president has a long record, a long history for people who don't like him to go after, whether it's women, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's you know, a number of other things that he said in the past. So I think people sense a vulnerability.
I think the vulnerability is entirely because it's completely made up by the Democrats. I mean, this is a man that has accomplished so very much. To call him vulnerable is playing right into the Republicans' hands.
But clearly people see that vulnerability, otherwise they wouldn't be jumping into the race.
They are absolutely created by the people who are eating him alive, people who are senators in the U.S. Senate right now. They're acting like they're better than him because they're younger and faster than him. And what they're forgetting is that he's an old white man who's trying to go up against a sitting president of the United States who's also an old white man.
But that's not where the party is, right? The energy in the party.
Where the party is.
It does, because that's...
Let me go to Christopher. Christopher, go ahead. Do you want to say something?
You know, I'm a Gen Xer, and we had one Gen X president, and now we're going back to baby boomers, or Biden might even be pre-baby boomer. I quite frankly think that it is time for the party to kind of move away from the baby boomers and pre-baby boomers, and I like Joe Biden a lot. He made a major gaffe last night, and quite frankly, that's not the first one, and when you make those gaffes against Donald Trump, you are going to go down for the count. Mayor Pete has probably the best political skill of anybody on that stage. The question is America ready for a 37-year-old man to be president of the United States, a man whose biggest achievement is being mayor of a town that has fewer people than within 5 blocks of where I'm standing? So I don't know where we're going to get with this and where it's going to go, but I do know that the party's got to shake it out and find somebody who's ready to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is a fighter. You know, I have my problems with him politically, but he's a masterful campaigner who picks apart people's weaknesses. And Joe Biden, while I think he was a great vice president and a phenomenal senator, and I knew him in his prime when I worked in the United States Senate for Chuck Schumer, and I thought he was wonderful. I still think he's wonderful. I just don't know if he's ready for this moment.
Look at the people on the stage. Look at the women on the stage. Why aren't we talking about them? Any of them can go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. Why are we talking about Mayor Pete? And I don't want to be ageist because he's my age, but Biden and Buttigieg, look at Klobuchar. Look at Kamala Harris. I mean, these are the women that are, my gosh. Klobuchar yesterday, why aren't people talking about the way she arrived? She really arrived, if you want to talk about that phrase, arrived. I hate that phrase in politics, but she really had some common sense things come out of her mouth.
There is quite a bit of consensus that she had a good night, Klobuchar. Todd, let me ask you this. Doesn't it also depend, for the Democrats, on where the candidate is on the political spectrum? You know, we had Barack Obama warn last week that if you go too far left, you're going to lose this.
Well, that was sort of what I was trying to get at when I was talking a little bit about Biden. And we have so many candidates. Some of them are sort of looking at, well, if he does falter, will I be the one to take over? And the person in that lane so far has seemed to have been either Amy Klobuchar or Mayor Pete, right? And so I think Amy Klobuchar had a wonderful night last night. I think she did really well. I thought Kamala Harris had a really good night as well.
Actually, we have a short excerpt of Amy Klobuchar. Let's watch that.
What I said was true. Women are held to a higher standard. Otherwise, we could play a game called Name Your Favorite Woman President, which we can't do because it has all been men, including all vice presidents being men. And I think any working woman out there, any woman that's at home, knows exactly what I mean. And if you think a woman can't beat Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi does it every single day.
She's making a very forceful case there, but are American voters going to hear that?
Yeah, I think there are women out there who are registered Republican right now who heard that. But the reality is the Democrats keep beating her down. See, this is what I'm talking about, Democrats eating their own. Are you really concerned,
Well,
Democrats? The party?
That's
Absolutely.
nonsense.
Come on now, be real here. This
That's
many
not true.
people, are you going to beat Trump like this, eating your own fractured party?
Politics,
this many people standing up?
Hey, I know you've been in politics. I've been in politics a long time. Politics ain't beanbag. Nobody gets beaten down. Everybody beats each other up. Nobody is in this for, this is not some nice game of checkers, okay? People got to rise through it. I think Amy Klobuchar had a great night. I love Kamala Harris in the debate. I think Kamala Harris would demolish Donald Trump in a debate, the way she demolished Brett Kavanaugh and the Attorney General when they appeared before the Judiciary Committee in the Senate.
Okay, get to the point, though. Why aren't Democrats
a strong woman
smaller
in there? But to say that people are beating her down, that's just a Republican trope to try to get women to vote Republican.
No, I don't pull out Republican tropes. I stood up against this president, and I'm an independent.
So if I could just interrupt. So two things. First, I agree with, I think, everyone on the panel that Amy Klobuchar and Kamala Harris both had very good nights and made some very salient points about, especially Kamala Harris when she talked about her plan for women, talking about older women in their late 20s and early 30s having to manage the balance between taking care of the children as well as parents. I think a lot of people in the suburbs definitely heard that and thought, yeah, I really get it. She gets me. And Klobuchar used both humor and sort of toughness to really sort of make her points. However, to Christopher's point earlier, look, I was at Joe Biden's campaign launch, and I sort of took a straw poll of everybody who was there afterwards. And what they said to me was, he sounds like every other politician. I was also at the Trump campaign launch, and people were queued up outside for days. And I don't think it's just Washington Republicans and other Democrats beating down on Joe Biden. I think if you go out to the voters and go on the ground, it is palpable that the enthusiasm for Biden is worrisome because people think he's too entrenched, he's been in politics for too long, and the energy of the party at the moment is with young, activist, sort of more left-leaning voters. Now, that's a different question than who can win in a general election. And there's this fear that the energy of the party, the people who support more left-wing policies, that's going to lose a lot of middle America.
Yeah, a lot of the Democrats are looking at
support is broad,
the
but
numbers.
Not deep.
1 moment, Christopher, go ahead.
A lot of the Democrats are looking at the numbers that we've all looked at since 2016, which is close to 80,000 votes across 3 states, are really what turned the election. And primarily, it was a lot of Democrats who didn't come out to vote in places like Pittsburgh and in Detroit and in Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Those places, the Democrats need somebody who can fire up the base and get them out. If they had voted in regular numbers in those metropolitan areas, they would have taken those states. So I think that it is part policy. It is part trying to find what can appeal to people in those Midwest states. I think Democrats are concerned about that, even in the primary section, but it's also getting people out to vote as well.
Okay, Christopher, let's talk about the other candidate that the experts say had a good night, and that was Cory Booker. He criticized Elizabeth Warren at one point, saying that the wealth tax that she's proposing was very cumbersome. He's looking at another kind of tax. But talking about the wealth tax, income inequality, wealth inequality in the United States, how big an issue is that? And when you listen to Elizabeth Warren, does what she proposed have credence among American voters?
I don't know if what she proposed has credence among voters, even though it impacts so few of them that I don't know why anybody cares about it. I mean, I'll worry about a tax on my $50 million in wealth when I have $50 million in wealth, and that's what I would encourage every American to think about. I thought Cory Booker, though, the thing I like about Cory Booker is I could see Cory Booker as president after this volatile period that we're going through right now, bringing people together. He seems like the kind of leader that can do that. I don't know who else on that stage kind of appeals to me in that same way, where they're going to be the kind of person to kind of bring people together and bridge the divide. So as for the tax situation, income inequality was a key theme in the 2016 election, and I think Donald Trump actually was the person who actually did best on that theme, even though as president he hasn't done anything to address the issue. So I do think it's going to be an issue in 2020. I don't know if the wealth tax issue, though, is the way to do it, because it's too easy to be demagogued against.
But one thing I will say about Elizabeth Warren is that she is very good and very relentless at bringing every single point back to the message that is her core campaign, which is to get corruption out of politics. The very first question she was asked about Ambassador Sondland, she brought it back to, well, how did Sondland get his ambassadorship? He donated $1 million to Donald Trump. I'm here to clean up politics. And so she is quite effective in getting her message across in a very targeted.
So it doesn't really matter whether you have $50 million. What she is saying is that I'm going to level the playing field here. The system is rigged, and I'm going to fix that.
Yeah. Frankly, I thought that she was going to have some trouble with the rollout of her health care plan and how to pay for it, which was really complicated and potentially scary to a lot of people, but she handled it pretty well. It wasn't a big part of the debate last night like it has been in some of the other debates. And I also agree that Cory Booker had a really powerful night, especially his closing statement.
People can say a lot of things about Elizabeth Warren, but the one thing she's been is principled in her stances for a very long time. And what I've always liked about her is that she's always had a plan. The thing is now, with Biden sort of falling back and Buttigieg being sort of questioned, Warren has sort of been more palatable to Democrats, it seems. But what she's really proposing is something that a lot of Republicans, whether they're more moderate or far right, are going to say. She's talking about fundamentally restructuring the American economy, and that's not going to go over easy. And frankly, you know, her policies are very left, and that's what she wants to be. She wants to remain even left of Sanders, for example. So it sort of almost puzzles me that we're at this point. Is it a winning formula, though? No, it's not. No, because
so Barack Obama has a point.
Can we be clear about that?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Could we be clear, though? You know, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren believe that the debate, the center has moved to the right. So they are starting the conversation further to the left than has been started before. They both, I believe, understand that in our republic, we are going to have to compromise with people on the right and then maybe find a center that's more in the center.
No, that's where I disagree with you. They don't accept that.
Started in the middle, and then they've settled on the right.
That's your opinion.
They have settled on the right.
True.
So Elizabeth Warren, I believe Elizabeth Warren understands that she's going to have to compromise to get her plans done.
She doesn't. She wants to ram something down the throat of this Democratic Party, and I don't blame her. She should feel entitled to do that.
You cannot ram anything down the throat of Congress, and she's been in the Senate long enough to know how to get things done.
Yeah, I'm with Rina. I kind of disagree on this one. I think Sanders and Warren have been very clear and very principled for quite a long time, and that what they're after is structural change, and they're not particularly interested in sort of compromising on that. I think what Warren is offering is basically kind of a left-wing populism that is the answer to Trump. That is the answer to where the Republican Party has gone.
And if we really want to be clear here, she wants the influence of money out of our politics. That's not really going to happen. Well, that's not going to happen unless Citizens United is overturned. I mean, these are fundamental changes that courts will have to do. And look at Republicans. They love this president because he's stacking the courts with conservatives.
Yeah. Okay, Todd, let's move on to another issue, the issue of race and inequality. That came up during the debate. Here's Kamala Harris and Cory Booker talking about it.
For too long, I think candidates have taken for granted constituencies that have been the backbone of the Democratic Party and have overlooked those constituencies. And have, you know, they show up when it's, you know, close to election time and show up in a black church.
Nobody on this stage should need a focus group to hear from African-American voters. Black voters are pissed off, and they're worried. They're pissed off because the only time our issues seem to be really paid attention to by politicians is when people are looking for their vote. And they're worried because the Democratic Party, we don't want to see people miss this opportunity and lose because we are nominating someone that isn't trusted, doesn't have authentic connection.
Has the Democratic Party taken the black vote for granted?
Well, this is important. Obviously, South Carolina, the black vote is going to be a very big segment of the population, but we have to think strategically about this. Usually they say there's only 3 tickets out of Iowa and 3 tickets out of New Hampshire. There may be 4 this time. You got to win New Hampshire and Iowa first to get the mobilization, to raise money, to get volunteers, and to keep your momentum going. And so we're going to see New Hampshire and Iowa, which are very, very white, not a whole lot of black voters there, really winnow the field. So by the time we get to South Carolina, it may look a little bit different.
And there's been a lot of criticism of that recently, actually. Another candidate who wasn't on stage last night, Julian Castro, has been sort of making a bit of a splash, talking about, look, we can't say that we're the party that represents African Americans and minorities if our first primaries are held in these intensely white states. And I think that was another point where the conversation we were talking about earlier with Pete Buttigieg comes back in, because you know, a commentator was saying, look, it's all very nice that Pete Buttigieg wants to say, oh, let's all get together and redevelop America on the world stage. But for African American voters who are worried about police violence, for voters who have relatives who are immigrants, that's, you know, that's not salient to them, and they're not speaking.
Well, look at 2015. Republicans were never the party of the working class. What did Trump do? He went to my native West Virginia and told coal miners he's bringing coal back. He told blue collar folks who were white older males who didn't have work that he's going to bring work back to them. I mean, this is a guy who had gilded toilets in the Trump Tower. So this is party. This election, excuse me, is going to be about authenticity, about connecting on the real issues, and courting a particular vote just doesn't make sense, because look at Doug Jones, the senator in Alabama. Look at how things are done these days. This is not about going to a segment and saying, I'm your person.
Right. Christopher, how much of a challenge is it going to be, if the Democrats want to build a winning coalition, to get black voters to the polls in the election next year?
Well, I think black voters are going to come to the polls in the election next year. I think that the Democrats have to have a diverse ticket. I think they have to speak to the issues that matter to black voters. I think they got to get people like Stacey Abrams involved in this campaign and what she's doing across this country to make sure that blacks actually have the right to vote and actually can exercise that right without added encumbrances that we're seeing in a lot of Republican-held states. And she's doing a great job with that. And we saw her efforts yield fruit in Kentucky, where she kept 157,000 people from being taken off the rolls right before an election that was won by 5,000 votes. So I think the Democratic Party has to reassemble the Obama coalition that got him elected. And they got to make sure that African American voters that didn't vote in 2016 in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin come to the polls. And they got to do that by speaking to the issues that matter to them and working very hard in those communities.
With all due respect, though, it's not going to be simply having a pick that's a black woman or a brown woman. That's just not enough.
Boer Deng, I want to come back to...
I agree.
Yeah, I want to come back to the impeachment hearings. We've got a couple of minutes left. One would imagine that these impeachment hearings would have damaged Donald Trump's chances pretty severely. But if you look at the latest polls, one of the polls put out by Gallup shows that his approval ratings have actually gone up by 2 points. How does one explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, there's a lot of fatigue, and a lot of people simply aren't paying attention. I mean, if you look at the viewership figures from the first week of testimony, you know, the first night with Bill Taylor and George Kent, 13 million Americans tuned in. I mean, compare that to Watergate, 80 million Americans tuned in. The environment in this country is sort of so fractured and so entrenched that there doesn't seem to be any sign of Republicans having any indication of backing impeachment. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, many people who are supporters buy into the idea that this is something that's perpetrated by the media and by Democrats. I think there was a poll out from Quinnipiac, which President Trump likes to quote, saying that actually there was, there was 25% of people they polled thought that it was a Democratic conspiracy. So I'm always quite fascinated by how well Trump seems to be able to cut these points and make his base, about a third of the country that really believes in him, hear that. And so, yeah, so impeachment was always risky for Democrats. It's quite clear that having gone down this road, they pretty much have to vote in the House, which they control, to impeach him. But at the same time, it was always a political gamble, and I think they always realized that.
And we have to leave it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.